Alrighty, folks, emergency press conference. You may have seen the news. Hasim Rahman Jr. has pulled out of the fight.
They understand that he's trying to get us to suck ourselves down. We're only going to go here.
This is not a joke. I am devastated. I cannot fucking believe this. We just found out this news.
They'll massage it, Jake Paul. They'll massage it. They'll cancel the fight, and they'll massage it and make it all Hasim's fault.
And this is just another case of a professional boxer, just like Tommy Fury, being scared to fight me.
What's going on, guys? Greg from GK back again with yet another sizzling hot take. I do not believe that Jake Paul was ever planning on fighting Hasim Rahman Jr. Now, before I get into the whys of the situation, let me just say that this is simply my opinion based on my assessments of the events that transpired over the past couple of weeks. Don't sue me. Alright, so let's get into it. I believe that both Hasim Rahman Jr. and Jake Paul were attempting to play each other, with Jake Paul ultimately coming out on top. So let's begin from the beginning. This is what Hasim Rahman Jr. was attempting to do to Jake Paul, in my opinion. So as you know, when the contract was originally signed, both sides agreed to fight at 200 pounds. This would ultimately be a disadvantage to Hasim Rahman Jr. because he is a heavyweight and walks around at about 230 pounds. Now, it wasn't really that big of an issue for him to cut weight because 30 pounds for a heavyweight is not a big deal. MMA fighters cut that over a 24-hour period. It's nothing. However, I believe that Hasim Rahman Jr. wanted to get every advantage that he could over Jake Paul, and it wasn't about the money for him. So he was planning on never losing the weight. And coming into the weigh-ins weighing somewhere between 215 and 230 pounds, which is essentially his walking around weight, maybe with just a couple of pounds lost from the brief training camp that he would have had. Once they were at the weigh-ins, Jake Paul would have had no choice but to proceed with the bout because there was too much money on the line and there were too many fighters depending on the payday of being on Jake Paul's undercard. As Rahman Jr. said, he would fight Jake Paul for $5,000. It didn't matter to him. He would take the fine because in his mind there was absolutely no way that he would lose against Jake Paul, especially with the weight advantage. He was planning on going in there, knocking Jake Paul out, and just collecting the clout that comes with it and possibly making bank in the rematch that was definitely to follow. If you're a boxing fan, this shouldn't be anything new. Fighters do that all the time. Orlando Salido famously did that against Vasyl Lomachenko and ended up winning the fight. Sometimes the fine is simply worth the victory. Not that I think that Hasim Rahman Jr. ever doubted himself or ever thought that he would lose to Jake Paul, but he just wanted to punish him as much as possible. And there are also rumors that he doesn't have the best work ethic, so maybe he just honestly didn't feel like it. So just to reiterate, the too long didn't read version is that Hasim Rahman Jr. was never planning on losing the weight. He was just gonna go in there at his natural weight, beat up Jake Paul, and collect the clout points. Now, before I get to what Jake Paul's plan was, let me just briefly tell you why I believe he was never ever planning on fighting Hasim Rahman Jr. And it's actually pretty simple. Jake Paul is not a good boxer at all. I think that people take a look at his knockout of Tyron Woodley and they get this false sense of security about Jake Paul's boxing skills. But if you actually watch both fights, he looked like a beginner. Granted, he looked like a beginner that trains a lot with the best coaches, but still a beginner. Jake Paul began boxing in his 20s. If you begin boxing in your 20s, unless you're Sergio Martinez, that once-in-a-lifetime athlete, or like a Deontay Wilder where you just have a crazy intangible, just once-in-a-lifetime power, you're not gonna get very far. You probably won't even make it to being a professional. And the reason for that is because your nervous system is already developed. So the proper way of fighting as a boxer, all the combinations, all the head movement and stuff like that is never going to be natural to you. Whenever you get punched, you're always going to go back to your natural fighting style, which is just sloppy overhand rights in Jake Paul's case, or anybody's case that's not a professional fighter. Ask any professional boxer what age they started training, and they'll usually tell you something like 8, 9, 12 years old, 14 if we really stretch it. But past that, you never really develop into a true boxer. It's just what it is. And Jake Paul, starting boxing in his 20s and not being this amazing athlete, I mean, he never really even had a chance. And people may say that Hasim Rahman Jr. isn't a talented boxer in his own right, and they may be right, But regardless, he is still a true professional boxer. And not only is he a true professional boxer with over 100 amateur fights, mind you, he's also a heavyweight. He's significantly larger than Jake Paul. Jake Paul was bothered by Tyron Woodley's power. By the way, speaking of Tyron Woodley, I just have to throw this in there. He is an absolute embarrassment. He is the reason why Hasim Rahman Jr. was somehow the underdog going into this fight. I mean, just absolutely ridiculous. But yeah, Jake Paul was bothered by Woodley's power. Listen to the post-fight interview after the first fight. He was damn near ready to retire. He's never been hit that hard. Jake Paul has shown nothing to suggest that he could ever handle the power of a professional boxer, let alone a professional boxer that is a heavyweight. There is a reason why the Athletic Commission actually made a suggestion to Jake Paul when he told him he was making this fight to maybe reconsider. It's not because Jake Paul is so good, it's because they realized that the discrepancy in skill, size, and experience is so great that Jake Paul could legitimately get fucked up. Not as just a figure of speech, but I mean for life. He could have gotten hurt, legitimately, for real. A fact that both Hasim Rahman Jr. and Haseem Rahman Sr. alluded to leading up to the fight. But Jake Paul is not a dummy at all, and neither is his team. So his plan never actually involved fighting Hasim Rahman Jr. And really, he wanted the same thing out of this fight that Hasim Rahman Jr. did. He wanted clout. He wanted people to say, damn, Jake Paul is a beast. He is for real. He's really gonna fight a professional boxer. Man, this guy's got balls of steel. That's all he wanted out of this, and he got it. So here's how he went about doing it. Whether it be through a knowledge of Jake Paul's trainer BJ Flores on how Hasim Rahman Jr. operates, or simply having an inside man in Hasim Rahman Jr.'s camp, Jake Paul set a trap for him. He put a weight clause into the contract knowing that Hasim Rahman Jr. was going to try and pull a fast one on him. He was banking on him not even attempting to make weight, I guarantee it. And that is why he set up a surprise weigh-in. Basically a check-in to see where Hasim Rahman Jr. was at with his weight cut. Because remember, that never happens in actual boxing matches, ever. People wait until the weigh-ins to weigh in. There is no check-in. And it's not like he was that far off the weight that there needed to be a check-in. He was 217 pounds, and just like Jake Paul said, and like I said earlier, 17 pounds for a heavyweight is nothing. So there was no need to check in. He checked in knowing that Hasim Rahman Jr. would be overweight, so then he could use it as an excuse to pull out of the fight. And at the same time, make Hasim Rahman Jr. look unprofessional and look bad. And Sean Porter predicted that exactly when they interviewed him about the fight. But let me play it for you once again.
Let's say Hasim Rahman and his camp are like, they understand that he's trying to get us to suck ourselves down. We're only gonna go here. They'll massage it, Jake Paul. They'll massage it. They'll cancel the fight, and they'll massage it and make it all Hasim's fault, and they won't take the rap for anything. You know what I mean? Like he really has a way of doing this so that he's kind of like covered all of the bases. You know what I mean? So
he knew. People knew. It was a pretty transparent plan when you think about it. But I do have to give Jake Paul props because while he's not a good boxer, he is an absolutely masterful marketer. I mean, just look around you. There's people that don't even watch boxing going around saying, damn, Hasim Rahman Jr. is this, he's that, he's scared of Jake Paul. All these boxers are terrified of Jake Paul. I mean, listen, I believe that Jake Paul was actually legitimately going to fight Tommy Fury. However, after Tommy Fury pulled out, that was it for him. He could have picked anybody else. There's plenty of other cruiserweights to choose from. Hell, Kenzie Morrison, the guy that beat Hasim Rahman Jr. recently, is continuously asking for a Jake Paul fight and saying that he's going to weigh whatever he wants him to weigh. Jake Paul doesn't want that. He doesn't want to fight a real boxer. He wants to provide you with an illusion that he wants to fight a real boxer, but he truly, really doesn't. He's not delusional. He knows he would have gotten fucking destroyed and possibly walked away with irreparable damage to his brain. He simply took advantage of the fact that he's a controversial figure and a lot of people want to fight him. And he took a guy that he thought might not have been very smart or very savvy when it came to this type of stuff, and he played him. And that's really it. So yeah, let me know what you guys think in the comments, and I'll see you soon.